Alright, so news of Uganda's anti-LGBT legislation has been circulating over the internet, and I just want to talk about why, even though a lot of people say the opposite, I want to talk about why it's not homosexuality that's a colonial import. It's not these Europeans, these white supremacists bringing homosexuality to the continent. They actually brought homophobia to the continent. And there were spaces in many African societies, pre-colonialism, for queer people. We're gonna get into it.
Don't play with me. Don't play with me.
I'm gonna be doing a lot of reading, so I'm gonna make sure that all the links to these articles are gonna be in the description. But let's start here. Uganda's parliament has passed sweeping anti-gay legislation that proposes tough new penalties for same-sex relationships and criminalizes anyone identifying as LGBTQ. The bill, which now awaits the president's assent, has provisions for the arrest and imprisonment of LGBTQ people for 10 years and up to 20 years, depending on the nature of their offense. In extreme cases, the punishment will be death. Death will also be applicable if the accused is a parent, guardian, or serial offender. So yeah, there are definitely more specifics, but I want to talk about why a lot of people are saying that, you know, oh, good job, yeah, because gays, LGBTQ stuff is so un-African. And I love this tweet because it's so true. Negroes dressed like this call themselves banning un-African practices. This is coming from The Guardian. Promoters of the bill in Uganda, which gained independence from Britain in 1962, appealed to populist notions of culture that frame homosexuality as, quote, un-African, alien behavior that was brought to the continent by Western imperialists. Seen through this prism, a strike against gay and lesbian people is a strike against colonialism and in favor of African nationalism and self-worth. Yet, as the scientists' report noted, homosexuality has existed throughout human history. Anthropologists found an ethnic group in Central Africa where it was customary for a male warrior to marry a boy and celebrate victory in battle by having sexual intercourse. In many cases, the laws being imposed so zealously were introduced by the European empires that carved up and plundered Africa. Peter Tachlet is a veteran human rights and gay rights campaigner, and they say prior to Western colonization, there are no records of any African laws against homosexuality. The real import into Africa was not homosexuality, but homophobia. It was enforced legally by colonial administrators and ideologically by Christian missionaries. The colonial narratives of racism and homophobia are very closely intertwined. It is one of the great tragedies of Africa that so many people have internalized the homophobia of that colonial oppression and now proclaim it as their own authentic African tradition. And obviously not just people over on the African continent do that. I think in order for white supremacy to even function, the people that they're oppressing have to internalize certain things to keep the shit going, right? You see many examples of that in this country, and you see it on the continent of Africa as well. Stonewall.org says this: the last men to be sentenced to death by hanging in England were in 1835 for engaging in homosexual sex, whilst at the same time there was an openly queer monarch, this article says gay but queer, monarch, King Mwanga, hopefully I'm pronouncing that, the second of Buganda, present day Uganda, who actively opposed Christianity and colonialism. The Igbo and Yoruba tribes, found mostly in present-day Nigeria, did not have a binary of genders, and typically did not assign gender to babies at birth, and instead waited until later in life. Similarly, the Dagaba people, present-day Ghana, assigned gender not based on one's anatomy, but rather the energy one presents. In the royal palaces of southern Sudan, daughters were sometimes given slave girls for sex. This, at the age of 16, on October 18th, 1884, Mwanga II, the king that I just talked about, became king of Uganda, or what is present-day Uganda. During his reign, he was known to have regular relations with women as well as his male subjects. He was faced with opposition, though, when British missionaries began converting the Ugandan people to Christianity. Because of this, some of the king's subjects began to deny him sexually, and those who did, he burned at the stake. Jeez. So I guess the king's half-brother took over after the British overthrew him because he was unwilling to conform to their shit. And his half-brother ended up being overthrown as well. I know I'm reading a lot. This video is gonna be mostly reading, but this next one, because I need the facts, girl. This next one is coming from the African American Intellectual History Society. The myth that same-sex relations were absent in pre-colonial Africa is one of the most enduring. Digging through history and drawing from African-derived examples, it becomes clear that traditional Africa was tolerant of different sexualities, orientations, and gender relations. Thus, it is a disservice to history to say that same-sex relations in Africa was introduced by Europeans. So they review this book, I think, or a book piece called Female Monarchs and Merchant Queens in Africa. So they highlighted the African phenomena of gendered males and gendered females, which refers to the way that the interconnected universe allows males to transform themselves into females and females to transform themselves into males. These transformations are encouraged by like a thought process that recognizes that sex and gender do not coincide, that gender is a social construct and is flexible and fluid, allowing women to become gendered men and men gendered women. Almost done. This is the last one. It's a little bit more lengthy, but I think it's very interesting. So this is from JSTOR. This is an academic article from JSTOR. I don't think it's a study, it's an article. Link in the description if I remember, hopefully I do. The title of it is The Deviant, quote, African Genders That Colonialism Condemned. So in pre-colonial times, wrote the late feminist scholar Naira Sudarkasa, women in West Africa were conspicuous in high places. They led armies, they played very important roles in politics. And in the case of the Lobdu people, present-day South Africa, there were even supreme reign queens. What it meant to be a woman in many African pre-colonial societies was not rigid. Among the Langi of northern Uganda, writes Sylvia Tamale, Dean of the Faculty of Law at Makerere University of Uganda, the Mudoko Dako, or effeminate males, were treated as women and could marry men. There were also the Chibados or Quimbanda of Angola, who were male diviners, who some scholars have argued were believed to carry female spirits through anal sex. For centuries, woman-to-woman marriages in pre-colonial African societies seemed to indicate to Europeans that the strong correspondence between male to man and female to woman was not prevalent in Africa. This practice of same-sex marriage was documented in more than 40 pre-colonial African societies. A woman could marry one or more women if she could secure the bride wealth necessary or was expected to uphold and augment kinship ties. The idea that a female could be a husband perplexed Europeans and often led to fantastical conclusions. An anxiety that historians discern in the historical record is how uncomfortable European travelers and later anthropological accounts were with the idea that their gendered worldview didn't easily map onto the societies that they encountered. There is among the Angolan pagan much sodomy, wrote one Portuguese soldier in 1681. They continue, sharing one with the other their dirtiness and filth, dressing as women. Another story, the Inquisition in Brazil had heard complaints about Francisco Manicongo, one of the Negro sodomites who serve as passive women, a Jimbanda from Central Africa who had to be punished for being a deviant in the eyes of Christians. Europeans averse to what they called sodomy expressed distress towards the idea that some people whom they perceived as men would dare be considered by their societies as women. With what the slave trade and colonialism implied, the more often forced but sometimes voluntary movement of people across the Atlantic, these transgressive gender performances became the target of the Inquisition. The church disseminated the message that individuals who did not conform to their idea of men and women could be a bad influence on Christian colonial society. So yeah, I know that this video was basically all reading, But that's how white supremacy works, right? They come into your shit, they come into your societies where there's so much room, so much room for different kinds of genders, different people to express their gender in different ways. There's room for sexuality, different sexualities. They just do not operate on this binary. They came into y'all shit, fucked the shit up. They came into our shit, fucked this shit up, and then convinced us that it is un-African to be LGBT, when there was so much space, when there was so much diversity, when there was, like, these people were a part, these LGBT people, I guess we will call them that now, right, in present day, were a part, were very important parts of African society. And then the colonizers and then imperialists came and fucked it all up and then convinced us to worship this white ass Jesus. Girl, I'm not doing that shit, but y'all know what I'm talking about. Convince people to worship this white ass Jesus. Convince people that transness, when we just read about all that shit, that's basically what that's transness, right? Convince people that transness, bisexuality, homosexuality, whatever, pansexuality, whatever, being LGBT is just going against blackness. Like, that is some real mind fuckery type of shit. For you, after how many fucking centuries of brainwashing, to look at your own, to look at the way that your societies used to function and then be like, oh, well, that's the result of white people. No, the way that y'all societies function with LGBT people all up in that shit was a result of y'all own culture. It was a result of y'all own culture. And when they came in there trying to put niggas on ships and shit, the missionaries, the church, it fucked everything up. So that's what I'm saying. Honestly, I'm of the belief that once we get rid of this once we get rid of Christianity, once we get rid of the hold that Christianity has, and y'all could be mad, the hold that Christianity has on so much of our people, the more we will be able to see white supremacy for what the fuck it is. The more clearly we'll be able to see this world. And so yeah, I'm just like, just go look at the facts. Go look at the research that these people have done. Go listen to queer people who are living on the continent of Africa. Do your research. Queer people, even from the Native fucking Americans, they two-spirited people, to how many societies in pre-colonial Africa, LGBT people existed. So homophobia is what's the actual colonial import. And once we recognize that, the more peace that we can have on this damn planet. Especially when it doesn't matter how many laws you enact, how many, you know what I mean, death penalties or whatever, people still gonna be gay. Whether they hide it from the state, whether they hide it from their family or the government, people still will be LGBT because it has existed and will continue to exist throughout all human fucking history. Get over it. On that note, thank y'all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you'd like to hear me run my mouth, make sure you check out my Patreon. Link is in my description, but it's patreon.com/AdrianExpression. And make sure that you have a good goddamn
me. Yeah, you could blow me. I ain't the only. You so lonely, insecure, they don't control me. I ain't the only. Press the holy, worship me. Yeah, you could blow me. I ain't the only. You so lonely, insecure, they don't control.